The instant I caught my husband kissing my best friend, life didn't suddenly freeze. That was the part that shocked me. The children were still laughing by the water. Someone nearby was turning burgers on the grill. An old classic rock song drifted through the afternoon air from a portable radio. The lake shimmered beneath the summer sunlight exactly as it had every year before. Everything around me looked completely normal, except my marriage had just fallen apart. It was Saturday, June 22nd, 2024, during our annual family picnic at a lakeside park outside Bloomington, Indiana. I had wandered behind the rental cabin searching for my daughter, Emily. At 16, she was more than capable of looking after herself, but mothers rarely stop checking on their children, no matter how old they become. A narrow trail curved behind the building toward a small grove of trees near the shoreline. That's where I found them. Mark and Jennifer, my husband and my closest friend. His hands rested on her waist. Her arms were looped around his neck. They were kissing with the kind of complete focus that made it seem as though the rest of the world had disappeared. I stopped walking. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Honestly, my first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. Mark was 51 years old. We'd been married for 23 years. Jennifer had been one of my closest friends since Emily started kindergarten. Our families celebrated holidays together. We attended birthday parties together. We sat in the same church pews every Sunday. And now they stood less than 30 yards from our family gathering, acting like teenagers, hiding a secret romance. I instinctively stepped backward. A dry branch cracked beneath my shoe. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Both of them jerked apart immediately. Jennifer's eyes widened. Mark looked as if someone had punched him square in the chest. No one said a word. Then a voice behind me quietly broke the silence. "Well," the man said, "looks like you finally found them." I turned around. Standing there with a paper cup of iced tea was Steve, Jennifer's husband. What struck me instantly was how calm he looked. No shouting, no panic, no visible anger, nothing. I stared at him, then back at Mark and Jennifer, then back at Steve again. The entire situation felt unreal. "What?" I finally managed to say. Steve took a slow sip from his drink. "I said you found them." Mark looked terrified. Jennifer appeared seconds away from tears. Steve looked like he was discussing the weather. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. "Aren't you seeing this?" I asked. Steve nodded. "Oh, I've seen enough." His answer only confused me further. Mark shifted uneasily and took a step toward me. "Linda, I can explain." A laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. Not because anything was funny. It was pure disbelief. "Please don't," I said. Jennifer quickly brushed tears from her eyes. "Linda, please," I cut her off. "No, not now." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Steve placed his drink on a nearby picnic table and looked directly at me. "Come take a walk." I stared at him. "What? 5 minutes?" "I'm not leaving." "Yes, you are." There was something about the certainty in his voice that caught me off guard. Meanwhile, Mark looked like a man trapped with nowhere to run. For the first time that afternoon, Steve glanced toward his wife. "You two stay here." Jennifer looked stunned. Mark looked equally confused. Neither objected. Something in Steve's tone made arguing seem pointless. I followed him toward the shoreline, mostly because my body was moving before my mind could catch up. We walked nearly 50 yards before stopping near an empty fishing dock. Gentle waves tapped against the wooden supports beneath us. A pontoon boat drifted lazily across the lake. For almost a minute, neither of us said anything. Finally, Steve broke the silence. "I've been expecting this." I turned toward him. "What are you talking about?" He folded his arms. "Linda, how long do you think they've been involved?" The word involved hit me harder than actually seeing the kiss. Because once someone says it out loud, there's no pretending anymore. I swallowed. "I don't know. 18 months. The number felt impossible. What? 18 months. Maybe longer. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I sat heavily on the edge of the dock. 18 months. Not a few weeks. Not a couple of months. A year and a half. Birthdays, Christmas dinners, family vacations, cookouts, countless ordinary moments. All of them built on lies. I pressed my hands against my face. Steve remained silent. Eventually, I looked up. "You knew?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Almost a year." I stared at him. I couldn't process what he was saying. If you've known for that long, why didn't you tell me? His expression didn't change much. He simply looked exhausted, like someone who'd been carrying a weight for far too long. Because I needed proof. Proof of what? Everything. I shook my head. Nothing made sense anymore. The picnic, my marriage, my friendship with Jennifer, everything suddenly felt fake, like I'd been living inside a story that wasn't real. Steve sat beside me on the dock. Then he said something I never expected. Don't confront them. I let out another bitter laugh. You're kidding. No. I literally just caught them together. I know. And you're telling me not to say anything? Not yet. I stared at him. Why? 3 more days. My jaw tightened. 3 days? My life was collapsing and he wanted me to wait 3 days? No. I stood immediately. No way. Linda, no. The shock was finally giving way to anger. I'm not playing games. This isn't a game. Then what is it? Steve looked out across the water before answering. When this is over, I want there to be no doubt. I frowned. What does that mean? Without saying another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. A few taps later, he opened a folder and handed it to me. The first image showed a hotel receipt. The second was a photograph. The third was a bank transaction. Then another, and another, and another. My stomach dropped. There were dozens of files, maybe hundreds. Dates, locations, receipts, pictures, financial records. Evidence stretching back months. Suddenly, I understood. Steve hadn't spent the last year grieving. He'd spent the last year gathering information, preparing, building a case. I looked at him differently. For the first time, I saw the exhaustion hidden beneath his calm exterior. Not weakness, not denial. Patience. The kind of patience that comes from carrying a painful secret for too long. 3 days, he repeated quietly. I stared at the phone. What happens in 3 days? A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't happy. It wasn't cruel. It was certain. Then he answered. Everyone finds out. Back at the picnic, I could still hear children laughing. Music continued playing. Families continued talking. Life moved on as if nothing had happened. But sitting there on that dock with Steve's phone in my hands, staring at proof I never wanted to see, I knew my world had already changed forever. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark and Jennifer behind that cabin. The image replayed over and over. Sunday morning felt unreal. Mark walked around our kitchen acting as though nothing had happened. He poured coffee into his favorite mug, read part of the newspaper, asked whether I wanted breakfast. I stood at the sink, staring out the window toward our backyard. The maple tree we'd planted when Emily was born swayed gently in the morning breeze. 23 years. Reduced to this, a performance. No thanks, I said quietly. Mark looked up. You okay? The question almost made me laugh. Instead, I nodded. Just tired. That much was true. I was exhausted, but I still wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. Part of me hated Steve for convincing me to wait. The other part couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd seen on that phone, because if there was more truth hiding beneath the surface, I needed to know it. Around noon on Sunday, a message from Steve appeared on my phone. Can you meet tomorrow? Cracker Barrel. 11 a.m. I stared at the screen for several seconds before typing a single reply. Okay. The rest of the day dragged by. Every conversation with Mark felt artificial. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every minute seemed longer than the one before it. By Monday morning, I felt completely drained. I sat behind the front desk at Bloomington Elementary, pretending to focus on attendance records while parents signed children in for class. Teachers stopped by with paperwork. The principal asked about scheduling for the following month. I answered questions, filed forms, smiled when necessary. On the outside, everything looked normal. Inside, I felt hollow. At 10:45, I told my supervisor I had an appointment and left the building. The drive felt longer than usual. The restaurant sat just off the interstate, exactly where it had been for years. Rocking chairs lined the front porch. Travelers wandered through the gift shop. Retirees sat near the windows drinking coffee. People living ordinary lives. I envied them. Steve was already there when I arrived. A thick manila folder sat on the table in front of him. The sight of it immediately tightened my stomach. Morning, he said. I slid into the booth across from him. Neither of us smiled. A waitress poured coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, Steve pushed the folder toward me. You should see this. Slowly, I opened it. The first document was a hotel receipt. The second was another, then another. Indianapolis, Louisville, Nashville. The dates stretched back nearly 18 months. Hotel bookings, restaurant charges, photos, credit card records, travel confirmations. My hands started trembling. Steve remained silent while I looked through everything. Each page revealed another deception. A business trip that wasn't business. A girls' getaway that wasn't a girls' getaway. Conference weekends that never existed. One lie after another. When I finally looked up, I felt sick. How did you find all this? Steve rubbed a hand across his forehead. At first, it was money. I frowned. Money? That's what made me start paying attention. He reached into the folder and removed another stack of papers. Bank statements, highlighted transactions, account summaries. I looked down in confusion. Jennifer had been moving money around, he explained. Not huge amounts, just enough to avoid drawing attention. I continued reading. Small withdrawals, transfers, payments, nothing dramatic on its own. But together, they painted a very different picture. Then Steve handed me another sheet. I stared at it. My stomach dropped. It belonged to one of my own accounts. What is this? Look closer. I did. 3 separate transfers, each worth several $1,000s, each approved electronically. I frowned. Then I recognized where the money had gone. Mark's personal investment account, the account he always described as part of our retirement planning. My chest tightened. Oh my God, Steve nodded. Keep reading. Page after page told the same story. Money quietly shifting, funds disappearing. Not enough to trigger suspicion, enough to build something in secret. I leaned back against the booth. The restaurant suddenly felt too small. I can't believe this. I couldn't either. The waitress returned with coffee refills. Neither of us noticed. Every financial discussion Mark and I had shared over the years suddenly felt different. Every excuse, every delayed purchase, every conversation about saving for the future. Had any of it been honest? For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Steve laughed. It wasn't loud, just a brief, tired chuckle. I looked at him. What's funny? You're gonna hate this. I'm already having a terrible day. Fair enough. For the first time since we'd sat down, he looked mildly amused. Do you know how I found out about the affair? I shook my head. The answer wasn't anything close to what I expected. Monday Night Football. I blinked. What? I'm serious. He took a sip of coffee. Last October. I stared at him. He continued. Jennifer bought a smartwatch. I still didn't understand. Okay. She accidentally connected it to our television. Now I was completely lost. And? Steve almost smiled. During a Colts game, her text messages started appearing on the screen. For a second, I simply stared at him. Then, despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh. Tiny. Brief. But real. The absurdity of it was unbelievable. You found out because of football? Pretty much. What message? The smile disappeared from his face. He looked down at his coffee. Miss you already? The humor vanished instantly. I looked away. Right. Yeah. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Technology had exposed what months of lies had managed to hide. Then Steve reached for another document. His expression turned serious again. This is the part you don't know. Immediately, my stomach tightened. What now? He slid a lease agreement across the table. I looked down. Then I saw the names. Mark Parker, Jennifer Collins, joint tenants, apartment complex, Indianapolis. Move-in date, September 7. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The words refused to make sense. What is this? They signed it in April. The sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade away. They're moving in together? Steve nodded. After Labor Day. I stared at the document. The affair suddenly felt different. Bigger. More deliberate. This wasn't two people making reckless choices. This was planning, preparation, a future, an exit strategy. While I sat beside Mark discussing retirement plans and weekend errands, he had been building an entirely different life. The lease changed everything. Because affairs can end. People can confess. People can change their minds. But signing a lease together? That required intention. Commitment. Planning. The betrayal cut deeper than the kiss ever had. Far deeper. Outside the restaurant window, cars continued moving along the interstate. Families headed toward destinations. Life carried on, yet mine had completely shifted. Finally, I looked at Steve. What do we do now? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced out the window before turning back to me. We keep going. For the first time, I realized this wasn't simply about revenge. It wasn't even about catching them. Steve wanted every lie documented, every transaction, every message, every hidden detail. And despite my anger, despite my heartbreak, I knew he was right. Because the moment we confronted them, everything would change. Stories would be rewritten, excuses would appear, evidence could disappear. For now, the truth still existed exactly as it was, quietly sitting inside folders, bank records, and documents, waiting, just like Steve had been waiting. And for the first time since that afternoon at the lake, I finally understood why. For the next 2 weeks, I felt like I was living two separate lives. During the day, I was still Linda Parker, school secretary, mother, neighbor, wife. I packed lunches, answered emails, paid bills, asked Mark what he wanted for dinner, smiled when appropriate, pretended everything was normal. At night, I became someone else, someone gathering evidence against her own husband. Even now, saying those words feels strange. But that's exactly what was happening. Steve and I met several times during those weeks. Never anywhere obvious. Usually small diners, coffee shops, or restaurants where nobody paid attention to two middle-aged people sitting in a corner booth. One meeting happened at a Panera in Greenwood. Another took place in a diner outside Martinsville. The farther from familiar faces, the better. Each meeting brought more documents, more records, more answers. And every answer seemed to uncover another problem. Mark hadn't only moved money, he had also borrowed against one of his investment accounts without mentioning it to me. It wasn't enough to destroy us financially, but it was enough to raise serious questions. Jennifer had been doing similar things. Not necessarily illegal. Certainly dishonest. Eventually, Steve hired an attorney. A few days later, I hired one as well. Walking into that law office was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The attorney's name was Rebecca Shaw. She was in her late 50s. Direct, professional, the kind of person who didn't waste words. She listened quietly while I explained everything. The affair, the money, the lease, the evidence. When I finished speaking, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "Linda, do you want a divorce?" The question landed harder than I expected, because until that moment, everything had felt like an investigation, a crisis, a terrible discovery. But divorce made it real, permanent, final. I stared at the carpet. "I don't know." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer." And it was. I was furious, humiliated, heartbroken. But there was still a part of me that remembered the man I married, the young father who stayed awake all night rocking a crying baby, the husband who drove through a snowstorm to help my mother after surgery, the man who used to hide notes in my lunch bag. I hated him. I loved him. Somehow, both things were true. That confusion became my greatest obstacle. Not Mark. Not Jennifer. My own emotions. Several times, I almost told him everything. One evening stands out more than the others. It was a Thursday. Mark sat in his favorite recliner watching a baseball game, the same recliner he'd owned for over 15 years. The leather armrest was worn and cracked from years of use. A bowl of popcorn rested beside him. The scene looked so familiar, so ordinary. I stood in the doorway watching him. For one brief moment, I wanted to forget everything. Pretend none of it had happened. Stay married. Stay comfortable. Stay safe. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small one. But I recognized it immediately. The kind of smile people reserve for someone special. My stomach twisted. The fantasy disappeared instantly. Without saying a word, I turned and walked upstairs. The following morning, I called Steve. I almost told him. There was silence on the line. Then Steve sighed. "Me too." That surprised me. What happened? "Jennifer cried yesterday." I sat quietly. Did it change anything? No. His answer came immediately. No, it didn't. Oddly enough, that conversation helped. It reminded me that I wasn't the only one struggling. Neither of us enjoyed this. Neither of us wanted revenge for entertainment. We were simply dealing with reality. Unfortunately, reality started pushing back. About a week later, Mark became suspicious. Not openly suspicious. Just enough to make me nervous. The questions started small. Where were you this afternoon? Who were you talking to? Why are you checking the bank account so often? Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But every question made my pulse jump. Jennifer apparently noticed changes too. One evening Steve called, "We've got a problem." My stomach dropped. What happened? Jennifer thinks something's wrong. I closed my eyes. Wonderful. As Labor Day approached, maintaining the secret became harder. Every day felt riskier than the one before. Then I made a mistake. A stupid mistake. The kind anyone could make. One Saturday morning, I stopped by Rebecca's office. She handed me copies of legal notes, financial summaries, and several important documents. I brought them home and left them on the kitchen counter. Then Emily called from upstairs asking for help with something. I walked away and completely forgot about the folder. 10 minutes later, I returned to the kitchen. Mark was standing beside the counter. My heart nearly stopped. The folder sat open beside him. Open. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Had he seen it? Had everything just fallen apart? Mark looked up. "What's this?" My stomach dropped. I forced myself to stay calm. School paperwork. The lie sounded ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Mark frowned, then shrugged. "Oh." He handed the folder back to me. Just like that. No questions. No investigation. Nothing. The moment he walked away, my knees nearly gave out. I sat at the kitchen table shaking. Then I immediately called Steve. "You won't believe what almost happened." He believed it, because similar things were happening in his house too. The pressure was building. The secrets were becoming harder to hide. Then another discovery changed everything. Steve uncovered messages Jennifer had exchanged with several mutual friends. At first, we assumed they were harmless. Then we actually read them. I felt physically sick. Jennifer had been quietly planting seeds, creating a story, building a narrative. One message read, "Linda's been struggling lately." Another, "I'm worried about her." And another, "She's becoming paranoid." Every message sounded concerned, supportive, sympathetic. But the goal was obvious. If the truth ever came out, Jennifer wanted people questioning me before they questioned her. That betrayal hurt in a way the affair hadn't, because affairs are often selfish. This was calculated, deliberate, cruel. For more than 20 years, I'd celebrated birthdays with her, supported her through difficult times, defended her when others criticized her. And behind my back, she was preparing people not to believe me. That evening, I sat alone on my back porch. The sun slowly disappeared behind neighboring houses. Cicadas buzzed in the distance. Someone nearby was mowing their lawn. Normal sounds, normal life. But something inside me finally shifted. Up until then, I had still been grieving, still questioning, still hoping. Now I felt something else. Clarity. Not rage. Not hatred. Clarity. This was no longer about saving my marriage. It wasn't even about exposing an affair. It was about protecting myself, protecting the truth, protecting my dignity. A few days later, Steve called again. His voice sounded steadier than it had in weeks. Labor Day weekend. I sat up straighter. "What about it?" "I have everything." The words hung in the air. Everything. The messages, the financial records, the photos, the documents, the proof. All of it. Then he added one final sentence. "The real show starts in 2 weeks." For the first time, I believed him completely. Labor Day weekend arrived with picture-perfect weather. Clear skies, comfortable temperatures, the kind of day people remember fondly years later. The truth is, I almost didn't go. By Friday evening, I was emotionally exhausted. For weeks, I'd been carrying secrets, collecting evidence, and pretending everything was normal. I wasn't physically tired. I was mentally drained. The idea of sitting in the same room as Mark and Jennifer while knowing what was coming felt almost unbearable. Around 8 o'clock that night, Steve called. "You okay?" "No." A brief silence followed. Then he laughed softly. "Good, because neither am I." For the first time in days, I smiled. "We've come too far to stop now," he said. And he was right. Saturday afternoon, family members began arriving at the Bloomington Community Center. The gathering wasn't unusual. Our extended families had hosted celebrations there for years. Birthdays, anniversaries, retirement parties, holiday gatherings. By mid-afternoon, nearly 40 people had arrived. Children raced between tables. Relatives carried casseroles and desserts through the doors. The smell of barbecue filled the room. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Mark arrived carrying a large tray of baked beans. Jennifer showed up shortly afterward with a peach cobbler. They laughed, smiled, talked with relatives, played their parts flawlessly. Watching them was strangely fascinating. Neither of them had any idea what was about to happen. At one point, Mark leaned over and kissed my cheek. I nearly pulled away. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine." The lie came effortlessly now. Months earlier, I would have felt guilty. Not anymore. Around 5 o'clock, everyone settled down to eat. Conversations filled the room. Football, grandchildren, politics, retirement plans, the usual topics. Meanwhile, I noticed Steve moving quietly through the crowd. Calm, focused, ready. Then, shortly after 6, his brother Mike stood and tapped a spoon against a glass. The sound immediately drew attention. Can I have everyone's attention for a moment? Conversations faded. People turned toward the front of the room. Children settled into their seats. The room gradually fell silent. Steve stepped forward carrying a folder. My heart immediately started pounding. This was it. Mark looked mildly confused. Jennifer appeared curious. Neither seemed worried. Steve took a slow breath. Then he smiled politely. I appreciate everyone being here today. Several people nodded. Others simply waited. The room remained relaxed. Nobody sensed what was coming. Then Steve opened the folder. Over the last year, I've discovered something. People exchanged glances. Steve continued. Actually, I've discovered several things. I noticed Mark shift in his chair. Jennifer suddenly looked uncomfortable. Then Steve said it. My wife has been having an affair. Silence. Absolute silence. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then the reaction hit. What? Wait, seriously? You're kidding. Voices erupted from every direction. Mark stood immediately. Steve, this isn't the place. Steve ignored him. Instead, he held up several enlarged photographs, hotel security images, restaurant photos, parking lot pictures, evidence collected over months. The meaning was unmistakable. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Several relatives covered their mouths. Others leaned forward in disbelief. Mark tried again. Steve? But Steve kept going. The affair began roughly 18 months ago. Jennifer looked like she might collapse. Mark's face had turned completely pale. Then Steve delivered the second blow. The man involved is Linda's husband. The room exploded. Heads turned toward me. Then toward Mark. Then back toward me again. Questions erupted from every direction. One relative dropped an entire plate onto the floor. The crash echoed through the hall. Finally, Mark stepped forward. This is being taken out of context. Out of context. I almost laughed. Steve didn't. Instead, he calmly displayed hotel receipts, financial records, travel documents, and photographs. One piece of evidence after another. Methodical. Precise. Impossible to explain away. Jennifer attempted to interrupt. You're twisting things. Steve handed copies to several family members. Read them. Nobody argued after that. The documents spoke for themselves. Mark's shoulders sagged. For the first time, I saw genuine fear. Not embarrassment, not discomfort, fear. Then Steve revealed the apartment lease. He held it up for everyone to see. The names were impossible to miss. Mark Parker, Jennifer Collins, joint tenants, move-in date September 7th. A collective gasp swept through the room. Several people actually stood up, because now it wasn't just an affair. It was a planned future, a deliberate decision, a long-term betrayal. Then Steve reached into another folder. One more thing. Mark looked terrified. Jennifer whispered something under her breath. Steve pressed a button on his phone. A recorded voicemail filled the room. Jennifer's voice, clear, unmistakable. The message discussed moving plans, money, their future together, the apartment. When the recording ended, nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. The truth had arrived. Completely. Undeniably. Finally. Then something unexpected happened. 82-year-old Aunt Carol slowly stood up. Everyone knew Aunt Carol. Sweet, religious, soft-spoken, the last person anyone expected to say anything dramatic. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Mark and Jennifer. Then she asked, so all those Saturday mornings you claimed you were volunteering at church weren't actually about church? For 1 second, the room remained silent. Then laughter erupted. Not happy laughter. Disbelieving laughter. The kind that happens when reality becomes too absurd to process. Even I laughed. Mark looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. Jennifer burst into tears. Within minutes, they gathered their belongings. Nobody stopped them. Nobody defended them. Nobody followed. They walked out together, past relatives, past friends, past people who once trusted them. The doors closed behind them, and they were gone. The silence afterward felt strangely peaceful. Steve sat down heavily, completely exhausted. I walked over and stood beside him. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then he looked up. You okay? I thought about it, really thought about it. Was I okay? Not entirely. My marriage was over. My friendship was over. My future looked nothing like I once imagined. But for the first time in months, I wasn't carrying a secret. I wasn't questioning reality. I wasn't being lied to. The truth was finally out in the open, and somehow that felt like breathing again. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Mark never moved back home. His clothes remained in the closet for a while. His toothbrush sat beside mine. But he was gone. The divorce process moved forward, slowly, painfully, methodically. Some days I felt angry. Other days I felt relieved. A few days I felt nothing at all. Rebecca helped me navigate the legal side of things. Property, accounts, documents, the practical work of untangling a life built over 23 years. Meanwhile, word spread quickly through town, far quicker than I expected. At first, I worried about gossip. Eventually, I stopped caring. The truth was already known. I no longer needed to defend myself. Several weeks later, Emily and I were eating lunch together when she looked across the table and asked, "Mom? Yeah? Are you going to be okay?" I smiled, not because I was completely okay, but because she cared enough to ask. Eventually, I nodded. "I think so." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That moment meant more than any revenge ever could, because it reminded me what still remained. Family, respect, truth. The things Mark and Jennifer had traded away. As the months passed, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I began volunteering at the local library on weekends. At first, it was simply something to keep me busy. Then I discovered I genuinely enjoyed it. I made new friends, read more books, built a new routine. Small changes, healthy changes. Steve and I remained friends. People constantly assumed we'd start dating. We didn't. At least not then. Neither of us wanted another complicated relationship. What we built instead was something simpler. Trust. Friendship. Honesty. After everything we'd been through, that felt like enough. Meanwhile, reality eventually caught up with Mark and Jennifer, as it often does. Affairs thrive in secrecy, in fantasy, in hidden moments. Real life is different. Real life includes bills, stress, responsibilities, consequences. Their new life together wasn't nearly as perfect as they'd imagined. Money became an issue. Trust became an issue. Arguments became an issue. By the following spring, they were barely speaking. By summer, they were living separately. Exactly 1 year after that afternoon at the lake, my phone rang. It was Mark. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Curiosity won. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Can we talk?" I already knew where the conversation was heading. He apologized for the affair, for the lies, for the money, for everything. I listened quietly, then he said exactly what I expected. I made the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. Either way, it wasn't my burden anymore. Then he admitted something else. Jennifer had left him. Apparently, she'd begun seeing someone new. The irony was almost unbelievable. For a brief moment, I actually felt sorry for him. Not much. Just enough to recognize that consequences eventually arrive for everyone. Finally, he asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you think we could start over?" I looked out the window at the maple tree we planted when Emily was born. It stood taller now, stronger, just like I was. No. The answer came without anger, without bitterness, without hesitation, just certainty. A long silence followed. Then he quietly said goodbye, and that was the end of it. After the call ended, I sat alone for a while and realized something important. The best part of the story wasn't exposing Mark. It wasn't humiliating Jennifer. It wasn't watching their plans collapse. The best part was understanding that their choices no longer controlled my future. That freedom mattered far more than revenge ever could. Trust can be shattered in a single moment, but rebuilding yourself happens slowly. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one honest step after another. Eventually, those small steps carry you somewhere better than you ever expected.